Imagine waking up one morning in a quiet medieval town, stepping outside into the cobblestone streets and watching a woman dance. Not gracefully, not joyfully, frantically, desperately. Her feet bleeding through her shoes, her eyes wide and glassy, her arms flailing with no rhythm and no reason. You watch for a moment, confused, maybe a little amused. You go about your day, but when you return that evening, she is still dancing. And the next morning, she is still dancing. And by the end of the week, she has been joined by dozens more. By the end of the month, hundreds. Some are laughing, some are screaming, some are dying. And nobody, not the priests, not the doctors, not the lords of the city, has any idea how to make it stop. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a legend passed down through generations, exaggerated and embellished until it barely resembles the truth. This happened. It is documented. It is recorded in the civic and church records of a real city, by real people who watched in real horror as their neighbors, their family members, their fellow citizens danced themselves to the edge of death and beyond. It happened in the summer of 1518 in the city of Strasbourg in what is now modern-day France, and it remains to this day one of the strangest, most haunting, most inexplicable events in all of recorded human history. Historians call it the dancing plague, and the more you learn about it, the less you understand it. But to understand how something this bizarre could happen, you have to understand the world in which it happened. Because the Strasbourg of 1518 was not a peaceful place. It was not a city of comfort and security. It was a city under siege not by an army, not by foreign power, but by something far more insidious. It was a city under siege by life itself, by the sheer, grinding, unrelenting misery of existence in early 16th century Europe. The years leading up to 1518 had been catastrophic for the people of the Rhine Valley. The harvests had failed, multiple times, consecutively. The kind of failure that doesn't just mean less food on the table, the kind of failure that means children dying. That means parents making impossible choices about who eats and who doesn't. That means watching your neighbors grow gaunt and hollow-eyed over the course of months, watching the old and the very young slip away first, watching the community you grew up in slowly, silently begin to come apart at the seams. Famine was not a distant threat in 1518 Strasbourg. It was a neighbor. It lived next door. And alongside the famine came the disease. Syphilis had been spreading through Europe since the 1490s, and it was still a terrifying, poorly understood, socially devastating illness. Smallpox moved through populations with brutal efficiency. The plague, the actual historical Black Death plague, was still a living memory, still a recurring visitor, still a specter that haunted every cough and every fever. People in 1518 lived in intimate proximity with death in a way that is almost impossible for modern people to fully comprehend. Death was not something that happened in hospitals quietly behind closed doors. Death happened in the streets. Death happened in your home. Death happened to your children before they learned to walk and to your parents before they grew old. Death was the background noise of daily life, a constant low hum beneath everything else. And into all of this came the weight of spiritual terror, because the medieval Catholic Church did not offer its followers a simple, comforting theology of love and acceptance. It offered them a theology of consequence, of punishment, of a God who watched and judged and occasionally unleashed catastrophe upon those who had strayed. When the harvests failed, the church had an answer: you have sinned. When disease swept through the population, the church had an answer: God is angry. When suffering piled upon suffering with no end in sight, the church had an answer: you deserve this and your only hope is penance. The spiritual weight that ordinary people in 1518 carried was staggering. It wasn't just the weight of physical suffering. It was the weight of believing that the suffering was your fault, that you had earned it, that God himself had looked down at you, at your community, at your life, and found it wanting. This is the world into which Frau Troffea stepped on a hot July morning in 1518 and began to dance. Her name is recorded. That detail alone sends a chill down the spine, not some anonymous figure from the distant past, but a named woman, a real person, a resident of Strasbourg who walked out of her house on a street in the Rue de la Cour one morning and began to move. The accounts describe her as dancing, though the word barely captures what witnesses saw. It was not dancing in any celebratory sense. Her movements were convulsive, compulsive. Her feet moved of their own accord, her body twisting and jerking in patterns that seemed to have no intention behind them, no joy, no music driving them forward. She danced through the morning. She danced through the afternoon. She danced as the sun went down and the stars came out and the torches were lit in the streets of Strasbourg. She did not stop. She could not stop. Her husband, watching this, must have felt a particular kind of helpless terror. What do you do? What do you say? How do you reach a person who seems to have left their own body, who is present in front of you and yet entirely unreachable, whose legs will not listen to their own brain, whose body has mutinied against their will? The accounts suggest that he tried to stop her, that others tried to stop her, that she was held physically restrained, and that the moment she was released, she began again. 4 days she danced, then 6, then a week. Her feet were bleeding, her legs must have been in agony, and still she danced. And then, this is where the story shifts from strange to terrifying. Others joined her. It did not happen all at once, it crept. First, a handful of others began to exhibit the same symptoms, the same uncontrollable movement, the same inability to stop. Then more, then more. Within a week of Frau Troffea's first steps, somewhere around 30 people were dancing in the streets of Strasbourg. By the end of the month, that number had climbed to over 100. Contemporary accounts, and there are several written by people who were there who witnessed this with their own eyes, describe scenes that read like something from a nightmare. Dozens of people filling the public squares of Strasbourg, dancing without music, dancing without joy, dancing with expressions of agony and terror on their faces. Some were bleeding from their feet. Some had collapsed and been helped back to their feet only to begin again. Some were calling out to God. Some were weeping. And some, the accounts grimly note, were dying. The city authorities were faced with a crisis unlike anything in their governance experience. What do you do with a mass outbreak of involuntary dancing? How do you write that into your civic records with a straight face? And yet they did write it down, multiple officials, multiple record keepers, all documenting the same extraordinary events with the careful, measured language of people trying to make sense of something that defied sense entirely. They consulted physicians. They consulted astrologers. They consulted theologians, and the answers they received were about as helpful as you might expect, which is to say, not very. The physicians of 1518 were working within a medical framework that would be unrecognizable to modern doctors. The dominant theory of disease and health at the time was based on the ancient Greek concept of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and the idea that illness was caused by these humors falling out of balance. The dancing plague, the physicians decided after careful deliberation, was the result of hot and dry blood. The treatment they recommended was, from a modern perspective, absolutely remarkable in its wrongheadedness. They recommended more dancing. The logic, such as it was, ran something like this: if the blood was overheated and needed to move, suppressing the movement would make things worse. The correct approach was to allow the dancers to dance until the excess heat burned itself out. To facilitate this, they should be given space. They should be given music to dance to. They should be given professional dancers to keep them company and, presumably, to provide some kind of rhythmic structure to their movements. The city of Strasbourg, operating on this medical advice, did something extraordinary. They cleared public spaces, the guild halls, the grain market, a space that is sometimes identified as a hospital courtyard. They hired musicians. They hired dancing troupes. They created, in the middle of a city in the grip of a terrifying epidemic of involuntary movement, dedicated dancing venues. They essentially threw a party for the victims of a disease. You might think this could not possibly make things worse. You would be wrong. The music and the space and the social permission to keep dancing did not help the afflicted dancers burn out their excess energy. It drew more people in. The number of dancers swelled. The dancing continued day and night, the musicians playing through exhaustion, the afflicted moving through pain that must have been extraordinary, their bodies continuing to do what their minds could not stop them from doing. The death toll, which had begun as a handful, began to climb. People were dying of heart attacks, of strokes, of sheer physical exhaustion. At the peak of the plague, contemporary sources claim that somewhere between 15 and 50 people per day were dying from the dancing. Let that number sink in, per day in one city from dancing. The city authorities, realizing that the medical approach was not working and was possibly making things dramatically worse, reversed course. The musicians were dismissed. The dancing venues were closed. A new theory had emerged, one rooted not in medicine but in theology. The dancing plague, the religious authorities now argued, was divine punishment. Specifically, it was punishment connected to Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr whose feast day was June 15th and who was, in medieval Catholic tradition, associated with a variety of ailments involving involuntary movement. The condition even had a name in the popular imagination: Saint Vitus dance. To cure it, you did not need physicians. You needed pilgrimage, you needed penance, you needed the intervention of the saint himself. The afflicted dancers were loaded into carts and wagons and transported to the shrine of Saint Vitus at Saverne, a few miles outside Strasbourg. There, in the chapel of the saint, prayers were said. Masses were performed. Red shoes, red being the color associated with Saint Vitus, were placed on the feet of the dancers and then offered to the statue of the saint as a gift. And according to the accounts, this worked. The dancing slowed. The dancers regained control of their bodies. The plague, which had gripped Strasbourg for weeks, began to lift. By September of 1518, it was over. The streets of Strasbourg were quiet again. The musicians had gone home. The guild halls were returned to their ordinary uses. The grain market went back to selling grain. and somewhere in the city Frau Troffea, if she had survived and the records do not tell us whether she did, presumably went home to her husband and tried to explain what had happened to her, tried to find words for something that had no words. Tried to make sense of weeks of her own life that had been taken from her by something she did not choose and could not control and did not understand. But the mystery did not end with the plague itself. In many ways, the plague's end was just the beginning of a mystery that historians, physicians, psychologists, and anthropologists have been wrestling with ever since. Because the fundamental question, the question that haunts every account of the dancing plague of 1518, is devastatingly simple. What actually happened? There is no shortage of theories. They range from the scientifically rigorous to the frankly speculative, and none of them is entirely satisfying. Each one explains some aspects of the events perfectly and leaves other aspects completely in the dark. And as you move through them, as you consider each one and then consider its limitations, you begin to feel something that the people of Strasbourg must have felt in the summer of 1518, a growing sense that you are confronting something that resists explanation, something that belongs to a category of human experience that our ordinary frameworks simply cannot contain. The most widely cited scientific explanation involves ergot. Ergot is a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, that grows on rye and other grain crops under certain conditions of warmth and moisture. When contaminated grain is eaten, the ergot produces compounds called ergot alkaloids, which are powerful psychoactive substances. Ergotism, ergot poisoning, was a well-documented phenomenon in medieval Europe. Its symptoms could include convulsions, hallucinations, burning sensations in the extremities, and involuntary movements. There was even a name for it in the medieval world: Saint Anthony's fire, named for another saint whose intercession was sought by sufferers. Given that 1518 Strasbourg was experiencing a grain shortage that may have forced people to eat grain that would not otherwise have been consumed, and given that the Rhine Valley in summer provided conditions favorable to ergot growth, the theory has a certain appeal. But it falls apart under scrutiny. Ergotism produces convulsions, yes, but not the rhythmic, purposeful-seeming movement of dancing. Ergotism typically presents in clusters tied to specific contaminated grain supplies. You would expect to see outbreaks in specific households or neighborhoods that shared a common food source, not a spreading contagion that moved through the city over the course of weeks and months. And most damningly, ergotism does not spread through social contagion. You cannot catch ergot poisoning from watching someone who has ergot poisoning. But the dancing plague of 1518 spread like an infection, moving from person to person in patterns that look far more like social transmission than biological contamination. Which brings us to the explanation that many modern researchers find most compelling and which is in some ways the strangest explanation of all: mass psychogenic illness, collective hysteria. The dancing plague in this view was not a biological event, it was a psychological one. Mass psychogenic illness is a real, documented, medically recognized phenomenon. It occurs when symptoms spread through a group not through physical contagion but through psychological mechanisms, through suggestion, through anxiety, through the powerful and often underestimated capacity of the human mind to produce genuine physical symptoms. The symptoms of mass psychogenic illness are real. They are not faked. The people experiencing them are genuinely suffering. Their bodies are genuinely doing things their conscious minds are not directing them to do. But the cause is psychological rather than biological, and the transmission mechanism is social rather than viral. Mass psychogenic illness tends to occur in contexts of extreme stress, in communities under pressure, social pressure, economic pressure, spiritual pressure, where existing psychological and cultural structures are strained to their limits. And this, of course, is an almost perfect description of Strasbourg in 1518. The famine, the disease, the spiritual terror, the accumulated weight of years of suffering with no end in sight. The population of Strasbourg was, in this reading, primed. They were sitting on a psychological powder keg, and Frau Troffea provided the spark. This framework, associated most prominently with the historian John Waller, who has written extensively about the dancing plague, offers a compelling account of how the plague started, how it spread, and why it affected the people it affected. The dancing in this view was a form of dissociation, a psychological response to unbearable stress that allowed people to disconnect from their conscious experience and enter a state in which their bodies moved without their direction. The spread happened through social contagion, through the power of suggestion in a community already primed for exactly this kind of breakdown. The cure worked: the pilgrimage to Saint Vitus, the prayers, the red shoes, because it gave people a framework within which to stop. It gave them permission to recover. It restored the psychological context in which normal functioning was possible. Waller's account is persuasive. It is grounded in real psychological science. Mass psychogenic illness has been documented in modern contexts as well, in factories, in schools, in military units, in online communities. It is not a medieval mystery. It is a human constant. The specific form it takes changes with the cultural context, but the underlying mechanism, stress, suggestion, social transmission, genuine physical symptoms, appears across cultures and across centuries. But there is something that even this explanation does not fully account for. Something that sits at the heart of the dancing plague and resists even the most sophisticated psychological framework. And that is the sheer physical reality of what the dancers endured. Think about what it means to dance uncontrollably for days, not to exercise, which involves intentional movement and regular rest, to have your body in constant involuntary motion for hours, then a full day, then multiple days with no control over when you rest or how you move or whether your feet are landing on hard stone. The physical consequences would be extraordinary. Your feet would blister and bleed through any footwear. Your muscles would pass through pain and into something beyond pain, the strange dissociated agony of tissue that has been used so far past its capacity that the nerves begin to produce sensations the brain cannot categorize. Your cardiovascular system would be under extreme continuous stress. The risk of heart attack, of stroke, of organ failure from dehydration and exhaustion would be very real. And people did die. The accounts agree on that. The dancing plague of 1518 killed people. For a purely psychological event, that is a remarkable outcome. The human mind under sufficient stress can apparently do things to the human body that go far beyond what we normally imagine when we think about the mind-body connection. The body does not know the difference between a voluntary marathon and an involuntary one. It burns the same fuel. It generates the same heat. It sustains the same injuries. The psychological origin of the dancing does not protect the physical body from the physical consequences of dancing. And so you have this extraordinary and terrible situation. People dying, genuinely dying from a condition that began in their own minds. There is something in that fact that speaks to something profound and dark about human psychology, about what we are capable of doing to ourselves, about the lengths the mind will go to when the pressures of existence exceed its capacity to cope through normal channels, about the relationship between the interior world of human consciousness and the exterior world of physical reality. The dancing plague is, in this reading, not just a historical curiosity. It is a window into something deep and disturbing about what it means to be human. And there is one more layer to this story that deserves attention, because the dancing plague of 1518 was not unique. It was not even particularly unusual in the context of its time and place. Dancing manias, episodes of uncontrolled mass dancing, are documented throughout medieval European history. There are accounts from the 13th century, from the 14th century, from the 15th century. There was a famous outbreak in 1374 in the wake of the Black Death that spread through multiple cities along the Rhine, Aachen, Cologne, Metz, with many of the same features as the 1518 Strasbourg outbreak. There are accounts of dancing manias associated with specific saints, specific feast days, specific geographic locations. The dancing plague of 1518 was not an anomaly. It was the last and best documented episode of a recurring phenomenon that haunted medieval Europe for centuries. What changed after 1518? Why did the dancing mania stop? Historians point to several factors. The Reformation, which was just getting underway as the Strasbourg dancers were finally brought to Saint Vitus's shrine. Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg less than a year earlier. In October 1517, fundamentally transformed the religious landscape of Europe, and with it the spiritual frameworks within which people understood suffering and disease and divine punishment. The specific cultural script that enabled dancing mania, the theology of saintly punishment and saintly intercession, the tradition of Saint Vitus, the particular combination of communal stress and collective religious imagination began to erode. New scripts emerged. New forms of mass psychogenic illness appeared, shaped by the new cultural contexts of the early modern period. The dancing stopped. Other things took its place. Because that is perhaps the most unsettling implication of the dancing plague. Not that it happened, but what it tells us about why it happened and what that means for us today. Mass psychogenic illness did not end in the 16th century. It has continued in different forms shaped by different cultural contexts right up to the present day. Modern researchers have documented it in industrial workplaces, in schools, in military settings, in prisons. There have been documented episodes of mass psychogenic illness in the internet era, spread through social media rather than the cobblestone streets of a medieval city. The mechanism is the same. The stressors are different. The cultural scripts are different. The symptoms are different. But the fundamental human capacity to suffer genuinely from something that originates in the mind, and to transmit that suffering to others through the mysterious channels of social contagion, that capacity has not changed. You are not so different from the people of 1518 Strasbourg. That is the thought that the dancing plague leaves you with if you sit with it long enough. You live in a world that is also full of stress, of uncertainty, of a gap between the life that you are living and the life that you believe you should be living, of accumulated pressure that has no obvious release valve. The specific theology of divine punishment has faded mostly from the Western imagination. The specific figure of Saint Vitus has retreated into historical memory. The grain shortages and the plague and the spiritual terror of the early 16th century belong to a world that is very different from the one you inhabit. But the human mind is the same instrument that drove the people of Strasbourg into the streets, that kept Frau Troffea dancing for 4 days and then 6 and then a week, that spread from 1 person to 30 and from 30 to 100. That mind is the mind you think with, the mind you dream with, the mind that sits with your fears and your grief and your accumulated exhaustion and tries, sometimes desperately, to find a way through. The people of 1518 Strasbourg did not choose to dance. They did not wake up one morning and decide that this was how they would respond to famine and disease and spiritual terror. The dancing came for them. It came from somewhere inside themselves that they had no access to, no control over, no language to describe or understand. And when it came, it was real. The blisters were real. The bleeding feet were real. The dying was real. The terror of not being able to stop something your own body was doing was real in a way that is almost impossible to imagine from the outside. History is full of mysteries, full of events that resist explanation, that sit at the edges of our understanding and refuse to move to the center. The dancing plague of 1518 is one of them. We have theories, good ones, plausible ones, grounded in real science and real historical research. But a theory is not an explanation. A theory is a sophisticated guess. And there is something about Frau Troffea dancing alone on a Strasbourg street in the summer of 1518, her feet bleeding, her eyes unseeing, her body doing something her mind could not stop. There is something about that image that exceeds the reach of any theory we have yet produced. It happened, we know it happened, and we still, 500 years later, do not fully understand how. We do not fully understand why it spread so fast and stopped so abruptly. We do not fully understand the mechanism by which the pilgrimage to Saint Vitus worked when the dancing venues and the music had made everything worse. We do not fully understand what was happening inside the bodies and minds of those hundreds of people who danced through the summer heat in the streets of a medieval city, who danced past pain and exhaustion and into something that for some of them became permanent, who danced and could not stop. Maybe that is the most honest thing to say about the dancing plague of 1518, not that we know what it was, not that we have solved it, but that it happened, that it was real. That real human beings lived through it or didn't, and that their experience was as vivid and terrifying and confusing to them as anything you have ever felt. That suffering does not require a logical framework to be genuine. That the human mind is capable of things that the human mind itself cannot account for. That the line between sanity and its absence, between control and its loss, between ordinary life and the kind of extraordinary nightmare that the people of Strasbourg lived through in the summer of 1518, is thinner than we like to think. Frau Troffea danced for days on the streets of Strasbourg, and then others joined her. And then the music played and the death toll climbed and the city fell apart and the prayers went up and eventually somehow it stopped. And then everyone went home and tried to forget, and tried to return to ordinary life, and carried with them for the rest of their days the knowledge of what the human body can do, what the human mind can do. What can happen when the weight of the world presses down long enough and hard enough on people who have no way to bear it and no way to put it down? The dancing plague of 1518, one of the strangest events in history and one of the most human.